Hi, welcome to Cast of Wonders, the fiction audio magazine for young adults featuring stories of the fantastic. I'm Graham Dunlop. Today we present part 1 of Peanut Butter and Jellyfish by Guy Stewart. Guy is a writer and science teacher who's been writing since he was 13. His main focus is science fiction and writing for children, and his passion is to someday create science fiction books that would do for today's young people what Robert A. Heinlein did for him. His work has appeared in Analog and Cricket, a Hadley Rill anthology called Aether Age Helios, the e-magazine Stupefying Stories, science experiments in Turtle and Hopscotch for Girls, historical and contemporary fiction, and the curriculum for 2 PBS science programs, to name just a few. You can find out more about him at sfwa.org, members G. Stewart. Check the show notes for details. Of this story, he says, "My first hard SF novel grew out of my fascination with the North American carnivorous plant called a pitcher plant, and wondering what would have happened if it evolved intelligence. That story is Invader's Guild, and it's still looking for a home, but I realised that among the young adults in the novel, there were stories about other young adults, human and huitar, that could be told as well." Peanut Butter and Jellyfish is the first of several stories I want to write about the huitar and the humans they interact with. Your narrator today is Familiar. And now, we've a tale to tell. Peanut Butter and Jellyfish by Guy Stewart. "I wanted the Earth grant so I could apply to the Observers Group," exclaimed Khalid Musrek. "But you're asking me to chaperone teenagers as a condition to receive it?" "Dr. Musrek, the public involvement clause was written in capital letters for a reason," said Davandria Jackson Frazier. "Human-huitar relations are tense. You'll have a microcosm of that situation. The Earth Grant Committee at University of Earth, Nairobi, thought it would send a powerful message to those who—" "Teenagers!" he exclaimed. Davandria took a deep breath, held it, then said, "You applied for the Earth Grant, Dr. Musrek. We gave it to you. Acceptance was tacit agreement to the public involvement clause. The humans are high school aged, and the huitar are age equivalent. They'll be with you for 10 days to observe and participate in your work on induced fluid drift and its theoretical impact on stabilizing global climate." "The impact is not theoretical," Dr. Musrek muttered. "They knew about it in the first decade of the 21st century. He paused, then added, "What if I just refuse to have anything to do with them?" Davandria shrugged. "The terms of the Earth Grant state that you are to host," she stressed the word, "a group of interested citizens once a year for the first 15 years of the grant. After that, you're free of obligation. If you refuse, the grant committee will withdraw their support." "They wouldn't dare, Ms. Jackson," he began angrily. She glared him into silence, then said, "You might as well call me Dee Dee. We're going to be working together for a few years." She smiled. "Dee Dee, then, I'd like to point out that there's no room on the barge for 6 teenagers. Even with the modifications you people put in, there's barely enough room for— We'll be airlifting 2 self-contained dorm pods. The students have been briefed about expectations and behaviours. They know that one word from you and we'll whisk them home and make sure they're chastised." Khalid paused, then asked, "What will the huitar eat?" "Each huitar will have a soil tray designed with their nutrition and health in mind. The rest of the time, they can eat what you do. The forms have been signed and thumbed. They're coming." She added a brilliant smile. Khalid said, "I'll detail Moreau to keep them chaperoned at all times." "That won't be," he bowed, saying, "Now, if you'll excuse me, Dee Dee, I'll have to find some pots for them to scrub while they're here." "That's not what—" "Good day," he said, breaking the link. With a sigh, Khalid sat down hard. Now he'd never get the world scientific community to take him seriously. His first attempt at generating non-academic funding had been 5 years ago. He'd granted an interview to some reporter, who'd then written the headline, "With a name like Musrek, he's got to be good. But is he?" Leading spokespeople representing anthropogenic global warming, cyclical global warming, universal global cooling, and Gaia cares for her children loathed each other, but agreed that he and his jellyfish prediction were crazy. "It's not a jellyfish prediction," Khalid said to his PhD candidate who was working on the interaction of ocean salts and marine mammal blood chemistry. "What's not a jellyfish prediction?" Antoine Moreau was also Khalid's personal assistant, diver and catamaran pilot. Khalid said, "Jellyfish provide for the stabilization of global climate. That's why there were immense cnidarian blooms in the aughts." "Yes, sir. Evidence for the role of Phyla cnidaria as an independent stabilization mechanism for global temperature fluctuation was a masterpiece. I confess it was my greatest honor to transcribe your brilliant babble and illegible handwriting into a coherent paper." He held up a finger when Khalid opened his mouth to protest. "I was just wondering if you were ready for lunch. The dome pods and the teens will get here around sundown." "Sundown?" Khalid shot to his feet. "They sent their itinerary. I forwarded to your compad, sir." Khalid exclaimed, "That's in 6 hours!" "Yes, sir." "I don't have time for lunch." "It's right here, sir." He handed Khalid a pita stuffed with peanut butter, bananas, and chocolate shavings. The doctor took it and bit into it as he walked out of the living space and onto the wide deck of the barge, exclaiming, "I won't have time to do anything." Khalid sat in the living space again, staring at his pad as the sun set over the western Pacific. He couldn't get past the observers group in order to read the stupid paper. He'd met the 6 authors at a conference 6 years ago. The aliens Kahel Barned and Tweetar were delightful. The velociraptoid Gliss creeped him out, but the totally alien Weetar had a delightful sense of humour. But the human Dr. Brent Tsian Hayes had only vitriol, saying, "Pseudoscience has no place in this group, Musrek." He was still staring blankly at the compad when Moreau stuck his head in and said, "They'll be here in 15 minutes, sir." Khalid looked up and said, "Take Nick and Jules with you to welcome them. Let me know when they're locked up." "You're scheduled for a nighttime snack with them, sir." He sighed, rolling his eyes. "Boil up a pot of spaghetti, stir the noodles or you'll burn them. I'll have a bedtime snack with them around the fire, maybe peanut butter on crackers. The Weetar are omnivores, they can eat plant matter." "It would be better if you met them right away," said Moreau. Khalid scowled fiercely. Moreau sighed and said, "Very well, sir." Cutting through the living area, he made for the galley under the bridge. Khalid shut down the pad and went to the airlock in the middle of the floor. Twisting the old-fashioned wheel, he opened it and slid down into the transparent bubble below. The plexi-steel was transparent and warm, and he expected they'd end up in Hawaii in the next few weeks. He closed his eyes and started plotting the next jellyfish survey. He started awake, surrounded by darkness, broken by the faint glow of green fluorescent protein, GFP, in a smuck of Aecoria victoria jellyfish. Scrambling up the ladder, popping the hatch and hauling himself to his feet, he hurried out of the living area onto the aft deck. A pair of translucent, lit-up brown dorm pads trailed the barge, emblazoned with the logo of the University of Earth. Heading forward, he wasn't paying any attention as a young Weetar suddenly spun around the corner, shouting in barely understandable English, "Tapu Habib! Yep, oi! Help me home! Pee! I want to go home!" He stumbled backward and fell on his rear end. He understood the English patois because he talked with the Weetar Wautvi for so long at the conference. This one had said, "Dr. Khalid, let me go. Take me home, please, I want to go home." Weetar had no tongue and prehensile lips covered a beak on top of their heads. A black girl following the Weetar skidded to a stop and said, "I am so sorry, Dr. Khalid. I'm Mosa Arrowsmith from South Africa, but Ifofe's never been on an ocean ship before, and he's been nervous ever since we left Nairobi. Have you ever been to Nairobi? I've lived on the continent my whole life, but I've never been there. It's the most amazing place in the world." Mosa lunged to grab one of Ifofe's tentacles, but the alien spun away to the fire pit and Mosa dashed after him. Wearing an apron and holding a long spoon, Moreau reached Khalid a moment later, looked at him and exclaimed in horror, "Dr. Musrek, are you?" Khalid groaned and pulled himself to his feet. "I'm fine. I was just going to talk to the teens when I ran into those two. Did anyone actually tell them where they were going?" Moreau opened his mouth, then closed it. "It figures," he said. Limping, he muttered, "No plastic neuroned adolescent of any kingdom is going to keep me out of the observers group." By the time he reached the 3 humans and the 3 Weetar, he'd calmed down. Moreau hurried past the fire burning under the cookpot in the metal fire pit hanging over the ocean. Khalid stepped into the flickering light and said, "Thank you for coming. I'm sure you won't like what we've planned for you, but science is all about being exciting and boring, dirty, dull, painful and tedious at the same time." Startled by the intensity in the human eyes and Weetar eye bars trained on him, he faltered. A Weetar raised a tentacle in a human gesture. Khalid nodded, and the large Weetar female, Himivi, said, "Dr. Khalid, do you know my—" Khalid thought the whistle click that followed meant some sort of relative from an extended family, but wasn't sure. He replied, "Sorry." "She did research on the effect of planetary gamete distribution in our home world's atmosphere. She discovered that wheat's atmosphere affects the distribution of gametes, but the gametes themselves could absorb or release heat, effectively stabilizing planetary temperature." Khalid said, "That's not what the jellyfish do on Earth. Cnidaria drives carbon sequestration in the depths, ameliorating dramatic cooling or warming changes by circulating ocean water." All the kids stared at him blankly. He added, "We'll be scuba diving and sailing." The Weetar teens whistled in terror. Khalid said to Moreau, "I want to talk to Devandria Jackson Frazier. Call her." "Yes, sir." Moreau hurried away, nightlights tracing the shape of the deck, doors and windows of the barge, showing him sprinting for the bridge. Mosa said, "Dr. Musrek, we want to stay. Even Ifofe, he's the one who screamed." She sat. Khalid scowled. Moreau came back, tapping his pad and pointing it in different directions and shaking it. Khalid said, "Don't you have her on yet?" "I can't get through, sir. Something's wrong with the—" "Forget it," he said, waving Moreau away. "Have the cat in the water at sunup. I also need you to keep the kids busy. Good night," he said as he stood and stomped to the living space, slammed the door, dropped back down into the bubble and locked the door. The next morning, Khalid woke stiff and cranky and surrounded by sparkling blue water. Climbing out of the bubble, he dressed in his wetsuit and headed for the catamaran slip aft between the outrigger anti-gravity impeller units. Moreau, red-headed Nick, who was barge pilot, once a soldier, general handyman, anti-gravity specialist and passionate jellyfisher, and model-lovely blonde Jules, hydrophysics doctoral candidate, were already in wetsuits, lecturing a group of 3 rapt primate and 3 rigid plantimal teenagers. The first rays of sunlight slanted in from the east. Asher Harris, the human male, and Ifofe, the Huitar male, sandwiched the 4 females: Luz Castillo, a Brazilian girl, Mosa, who elbowed Asher as he flirted with Luz, and Himivi, with the scientist relative, and Meremi, focused their forward eyebrows on him as the entire mob turned. He coughed into his hand, then said, "Well then, are we ready to hit the water?" Moreau and the others directed the teens onto the 18-metre catamaran. He had to stay behind to pilot the barge and prepare lunch. In 15 minutes, Jules and Nick had them seated and away from the barge. As Nick piloted, Khalid used the subsurface scanner, searching for a smuck of jellyfish. He wanted to get an idea of how the kids worked together. "Slow down," he called, leaning closer to the display screen. He glanced at Nick, scowled and said, "You cut your hair?" Nick laughed, throwing his head back, shaking a spiked mass of copper red. "Yep, reminded me too much of my life on land, so I chopped it and tossed it in the ocean." "You threw it in the ocean?" Nick's usual smile disappeared while he slowed the cat and brought it around, aligning it with the flow of the smuck beneath them and then setting the autopilot. He turned back to Khalid. "A symbolic break from my past. Cool, huh?" Khalid said, "Why?" He'd always wondered what the youngster was doing in the ocean, tending an old man's whims. Nick said, "The Earth grant's good forever. You're going to need someone to drive the cat and the barge and keep the anti-grav impellers running. I'll never set foot on soil again." He spread his arms as if presenting himself, a goofy grin on his face. "You don't have a family or a girlfriend somewhere?" The smile vanished and he muttered, "I don't want to talk about it." He turned, tapped a few more keys on the control keyboard, then said, "I'm going to help Jules get him ready for the dive." He crabbed across the netting from the bridge to the porthole and disappeared below. Khalid crabbed after Nick, and by the time he got there, the human teens were suited in wetsuits, gill packs, face bubbles with comm units, and a pressurized air tank for emergencies. The Huitar looked like a mobile, needleless saguaro cacti in plastic storage bags with equipment in the bottom to keep them upright. Khalid pulled on his own gear and said, "Let's go." I dropped off the aft dock and submerged, sliding down amid the blue light and small jellyfish, none bigger than his hand. He switched on his comm and said, "Jellyfish swim by contracting and relaxing sets of muscles at the margin of the upside-down bowl, called the bell. Contractions tighten the edge of the bell, working like drawstrings on a nylon bag, forcing water out through the bottom. That pushes the jellyfish forward. Relaxing the muscles opens the bell again." They watched. He added, "Never let any part of the jellyfish touch bare skin. Any nematocyst anywhere on the body can inject venom into anything that comes into contact with the jellyfish, even after the jelly is dead." "What are we doing down here then?" asked Asher. "To witness induced fluid drift. You can't see it in a tank." He lifted his hand and led them down. "I have in my hand a vial of dye. It will fluoresce when I turn on this light." He snapped on a wrist lamp tuned to the dye's peak fluorescing frequency, and the vial glowed green. "Now watch around the edges of the jellyfish as it swims." He squeezed the dye tube. The jellyfish swam into the cloud, and with the contractions, glowing curls formed around it, showing that a single contraction could move a non-proportional amount of water. "Did you see that?" Luz said, "Is that why sharks are able to smell blood from so far away? Because jellyfish and other little fish move the water?" Over the general comm system, Khalid heard Asher snarl, "I couldn't see anything because this fat weed was in my way." A lower-pitched whistle click of the female Meremi snapped back on the circuit. "If you weren't trying to shove your way around me, Weasel, you could have seen what was going on." Khalid bellowed in rage, "Everyone back in the boat!" Stroking for the surface, he breached like a whale, landed on the diving platform, and peeled off his mask before the others reached the cat. Jules waited in the water while the teens clambered aboard. Khalid grabbed Asher's wetsuit and Meremi's resealable bag, shaking both of them. "What are you doing here?" he shouted. "I'm here to study," Asher began. "How can you study anything with a closed mind?" Khalid snarled, shaking both teens. "I don't have a..." Meremi began. "Thinking you're superior to a different intelligence is closed mind." "My attitude toward weeds," Asher began. Khalid shook him again and said, "Say that word again and I'll prick your finger, throw you in the ocean and cheer while a great white shark nibbles you into bloody gobbets." Asher looked down to Jules. She spread her hands up in surrender and said, "I don't speak a word against my PhD advisor until he's dead." The colour drained from the boy's face. Khalid spun on the Wheatar girl. Her head fans were up, her hand tentacles rigid, and she whistled, "But the weasel," as she tried to pull away. Khalid dug his fingers into the pressurized fluid sac of her arm and leaned hard against her. "Any more speciest crap, and I'll send you home in disgrace." He pulled both of them close and lowered his voice, saying, "This is scientific research. Get rid of your prejudicial ideologies and let evidence inform your conclusion. If I hear another specious squeak or whistle out of either of you, I'll ship you home in as much disgrace as I can manage." Khalid pushed them both away, wiping his hands on his leg. Asher staggered backward. Ifofhe spun out of control and bounced off the railing like a pinball. Khalid growled at the gaping Nick, "Get this boat back to the barge and tell Moreau that our youngsters will be eating peanut butter bread and water until further notice." 5 hours later, Moreau walked up to Dr. Khalid, who stood staring out over the water. Moreau said, "Ms. Jackson Frazier wants you to call here." He glanced at the young man. "What's wrong with the comm?" "It's still down. Ms. Jackson Frazier wanted to remind you that she doesn't think short rations are a good publicity move." Without heat, he asked, "How'd she find that out?" "Teens networking with friends." Khalid looked up at him and said, "Figures." He held his hand out for Moreau's cell phone. "Go back and make some more peanut butter sandwiches for our guests." Moreau said, "The humans won't have any trouble living off peanut butter sandwiches and water, but I'm not sure about the Wheatar, sir." Moreau shuffled his feet until Khalid said, "Send Luz and Ifofhe to me." "Yes, sir," said Moreau. "The peanut butter sandwiches, they can eat peanut butter," Khalid said. Moreau disappeared into the living area and came back out with the females standing to one side at a look from Khalid. Luz exclaimed, "It's not fair, Dr. Musrek. They're the ones who are—" Khalid held up his hand. Luz opened her mouth to speak, but Moreau touched her shoulder and she stopped. Khalid said, "You were prepared to tell me how unfair I'm being because it's not your fault that your comrade's a speciest." Luz nodded. Hemivi's fans lifted up in a Weetar nod. Khalid added, "I have 3 grown children who always said the same thing." Ifofe whistled, "Erawahu Pramem." Khalid knew she'd said, "They're the ones who have the problem." Humans have peer pressure. Huitar have pod crowding. You can teach them a lesson in inter-kingdom tolerance. "We can't," Luz began. "You two are the best and brightest. Use your charm, intelligence, and leadership ability to shape them up before you waste any more of your valuable research days." He lifted his chin and the two trudged away, fingers and tentacles of manipulation playing with each other. Khalid looked up at Moreau. "Anything else?" "No, sir. I think the others are going to be even more afraid of you than they were before. I'll go make peanut butter sandwiches." "You do that." And part 1 of Peanut Butter and Jellyfish ends here. What will happen next? There seems to be quite a bit of discord in our little group. Join us next time and find out. Drop by our forum and tell us what you thought of this story. Visit castofwonders.org/forums and hit us with your feedback. Cast of Wonders is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. Share it, but don't change it or sell it. Theme is Appeal to Heavens by Alexei Nov from musicalley.com.